if you're still one of the fools on the X app, Twitter, you'll know that Kurt Angle was a big topic of conversation cutting across many different corners of wrestling Twitter this weekend. In fact, you know what? Fuck it. Let's rip up the format sheet. Let's open with that Kurt Angle discussion. Dave Meltzer catching it from the WWE Freakazoid contingent for having never given Kurt Angle, having never doled out a Kurt Angle 5-star match. With the idea being that Dave Meltzer doesn't respect the career of Kurt Angle, underrates him, this and that. With the premise being if he never gave him a 5-star match, then he must not think he's an all-time great wrestler and all of this. A preposterous argument for a couple of different reasons. One reason is Dave Meltzer used to be far stingier with his 5-star matches. His explanation is that as time moves forward, pro wrestling gets better. And now he seemingly gives out 5 and even 6-star matches, several times a month. I mean, you just look at 2024 and he has given out 5 stars or better 4 times in January, twice in February, and twice in March. That's just this year. That's 8 matches, 5 stars or better from Dave Meltzer. And 4 of those matches actually are over 5 stars, with a 6-star match from Michael Oku versus Will Ospreay from February 18th. Just as a point of comparison, for the entire decade of the 2000s, 2000 to 2009, Dave Meltzer handed out 7 5-star ratings for the entire decade. He has nearly matched that this year. And as I record this, it is March 17th. So, and I can give you other comparisons and statistics that show you that Dave-flation is real. He just doles out the 5s far more liberally than he ever did before. And again, his explanation is, as time moves forward, wrestling gets better. Whether you agree with that, disagree with that, that's his methodology. They're his star ratings. On one hand, I agree with the people who say it's one man's opinion and you can't really pay it all that much mind. That is true. On the other hand, it is Dave Meltzer, and a 5-star rating from Dave Meltzer really used to mean something. It didn't mean that you had to agree with his rating and agree that whatever match he gave 5 stars was automatically an all-time great match. But he was the top critic in pro wrestling for decades. And there was some cachet attached to getting a 5-star match, which at the rate he hands them out now, there's no question it's not as special. And something is lost with the rate that he hands them out. But it just is what it is. And when you look at Kurt Angle, there's a reason I brought up the decade of the 2000s to compare to the first 2.5 months of 2024 in terms of total 5-star matches. It's because the decade of the 2000s were Kurt Angle's prime. And in the prime of Kurt Angle's career, which I think most of us would agree, was 1999 to about, 2010, a few years into his TNA run. And then after that, while there may have been a couple great matches that snuck in there, it was diminishing returns really from that point forward. So Kurt Angle, more than maybe any other quote-unquote great wrestler in history, has a pretty well-defined, clean decade of prime. From roughly 2000 to 2009 that we can look at. And that also happens to be the stingiest decade of 5-star matches that Dave Meltzer, you'd have to go back. I mean, really, that is the stingiest decade, because as I look at the list, the 80s, he had 24 5-star matches. The 90s, we're looking at far more than that. Dave really doled out a ton of 5-star matches in the 90s, about 60, and then, as I said, 7 in the 2000s. And then the 2010s, obviously, it blows up. That's where the Daveflation takes hold. So it was a stingy decade for Dave. He didn't love the wrestling in the 2000s at the highest level as he did in any other decade. And when you look at the matches that he did rate 5 stars in the 2000s, I mean, you're looking at a lot of Kenta Kobashi, a lot of Samoa Joe, the Dragon Gate 6-man from Supercard of Honor, the Christopher Daniels, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe 3-way from TNA. So the standard was pretty high. So that's one reason Kurt Angle doesn't have any 5-star matches. Dave was a hard marker that decade. The decade that Kurt Angle peaked. The other reason it's a preposterous argument that Dave Meltzer didn't like Kurt Angle as a performer is that anybody who was around in real time knows that Dave Meltzer was unabashedly Kurt Angle's biggest cheerleader during Kurt Angle's prime. In fact, Dave Meltzer was such a Kurt Angle cheerleader that he was routinely bashed in real time by the hardcore smarks, the message board posters, that he was way too high on Angle, that he overrated Angle's stuff. One of the biggest debates of that era was that Kurt Angle waltzed into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame way too soon. Meltzer has countless Kurt Angle matches rated 4 stars or better. 3 at 4 3/4, which doesn't sound like a lot. That's like 1 G1 for Will Ospreay, but it was a different era. Less stuff made tape. So this idea from these fans, many of whom may not have even been born when some of these matches took place, or just weren't aware of the discourse at the time, that Dave Meltzer had some kind of bias against Kurt Angle because he never gave him a 5-star match. It's just completely ridiculous. It's just funny reading it. And anybody who was around in real time knows that. Now, my opinion on Kurt Angle, look, I think he was a great wrestler. I don't think he was an all-time great. Is Kurt Angle one of the 1,000 greatest wrestlers of all time? I mean, how do you define all-time great? Yeah, I'd say he's one of the 1,000 greatest wrestlers of all time. So if that's your definition, okay, he's an all-time great. Do I think he's one of the 10 greatest wrestlers of all time? No, I do not. No, not even close. Top 25? No. I wouldn't have him in my top 25. Top 50? No. No. Top 100? I don't know. Maybe. I'd have to really think about it. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. That's where I'd start to think about, okay, Kurt Angle might crack a Joe Lanza top 100. Maybe. So does that qualify as an all-time great? Depends what your definition is. Top 500? Yeah. I'd say with certainty he'd be one of my top 500 wrestlers of all time. When you're talking about like top 50, top 100, that's really not a lot of wrestlers if you start jotting them down. And maybe some of you think Kurt Angle is one of the 10 best wrestlers of all time. Okay, I'm not going to die on the hill telling you you're wrong. The thing about it is there's a lot of people who would die on that hill. In real time, Kurt Angle was one of the most divisive wrestlers in the business. Full stop. In hardcore circles, in places like message boards, like DVDVR, and places like that, Kurt Angle was not this, beloved work rate darling that he was in other circles and has become to a certain segment of fans, mostly WWE-centric fans who grew up on Kurt Angle and grew up on all those great Kurt Angle matches in the 2000s. And to them, it's unheard of. It's ridiculous. It's preposterous if someone says Kurt Angle isn't one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, let alone isn't a great wrestler, period. But there's a lot of people that hold that opinion. And a lot of the Kurt Angle critiques are that he didn't sell enough. That's the primary critique. That he was too much of a, quote, go, go, go pro wrestler. Just move after move. With not much thought or psychology behind them and a lack of selling. If it sounds familiar, it's a lot of the same complaints you hear about a lot of wrestlers today. Which shouldn't make it hard to understand why he was criticized in some circles. But it's so funny because you have modern fans thinking that Dave Meltzer underrates Kurt Angle because he never gave him a mythical 5-star match, despite the fact that Dave gave Kurt Angle plenty of highly rated matches, well over 4 stars, several 4 3/4 star matches. And then you have an entire other generation or half generation of fans from a few years earlier who feel like Dave Meltzer overrated Kurt Angle his entire career and mythologized a guy who wasn't as good as Meltzer and others thought he was, and that his reputation carries today. So Meltzer was kind of getting it from both ends all weekend. He both was accused of underrating and overrating the same wrestler. And again, this is why, while I agree with the idea that, look, it's one man's ratings, you shouldn't overly concern yourself with it. And I don't. I'm curious about Dave's ratings like anyone else. I look at them. Most of the time, I'm in the same general neighborhood. I wouldn't even say, yeah, most of the time. Sometimes I think Dave is completely out to lunch. But I don't let that ruin my day. I don't pester him on Twitter all day to explain himself. I just chalk it up to a shoulder shrug, and, well, I disagree with Dave on that one. And usually it's when he's higher than me. Because these days, the Dave-flation is real. And when it comes to Kurt Angle, I fall somewhere in the middle. My opinion is closer to Dave's than it is to the old DVD-VR crew or the Segunda Queda guys, which it was Eric Ritz who had a great tweet thread. He was probably fed up with reading how Dave Meltzer was underrating Kurt Angle so badly. So it's at Segunda Queda on Twitter. That's Eric Ritz of Segunda Queda who runs that account. I believe it's Eric. And he had a tremendous Twitter thread explaining what Kurt Angle's reputation was in real time among hardcore fans, which might be hard for younger people who just assume that Kurt Angle has been considered an all-time great. By virtually everyone. It might be hard for you to wrap your head around, but that's the truth. I lived it too. I was there. Again, this is one of the most divisive wrestlers of all time. Right up there with, I guess a good comp would be Will Ospreay today, although a lot of people are starting to come around on Will Ospreay, but you still have a lot of people who think Will Ospreay is the absolute drizzling shits, and then you have another contingent of people, me among them. I feel like he's essentially the modern-day Ric Flair, this generation's Ric Flair. I've seen some people say that he's already the greatest wrestler of all time. I would pump the brakes on that. He has the ability to get there. I think he's the greatest wrestler today, and I think he has been for a half decade. I think he's the modern Ric Flair. I wouldn't go as far as to say he's the best of all time at this point. But there are some people who would, and there's other people who will tell you that he absolutely sucks. That's very similar to what the Kurt Angle discourse was circa, 2003. It's true. It's damn true. I feel disgusting for even saying that. Shawn Michaels in real time. Same thing. If you go through old pro wrestling torches, right? From 1996, 1997, when Shawn Michaels was at the top of the wrestling world, considered by many to be the best wrestler in the United States, considered by some to be the best wrestler in the world, you will find comments from a young Joe Lanza burying Shawn Michaels underneath the fucking earth in some of those pro wrestling torches. Where Wade would take call-in reviews to pay-per-views or faxes. There I was, young smark Joe Lanza, telling the world how bad I thought Shawn Michaels was. And now today, once again, that might be hard for younger fans to believe, but he was very divisive. And I've kind of come around on Shawn's work. Again, do I think he's an all-time great? I don't. Do I think he's as bad as I thought he was in 1996? When I was freshly discovering New Japan Juniors and getting into going to ECW shows, and at the height of my smarkdom, at the worst age to be the height of your smarkdom, being a little wise ass. No, I don't think he's as bad as I thought he was in 1996. Of course I think he's a great wrestler. But he's someone else, again, that I probably fall somewhere in the middle on. But Kurt Angle was just as, if not even more divisive than Shawn Michaels a few years later. Very comparable to Will Ospreay today. And there's very few wrestlers that aren't divisive. I can only think of a few pro wrestlers who don't have super harsh critics. Rey Mysterio Jr. I don't know many Rey Mysterio Jr. critics. If they're out there, I haven't seen them. Pretty much universally, people think he's pretty okay. If not great, if not the greatest ever. Terry Funk. I don't know of many Terry Funk detractors. But, name pretty much anyone else. I mean, Ric Flair. There are people who will tell you that Ric Flair had the same match every night. And not just Ole Anderson. Fans. In real time. I was there too for that. In real time, Ric Flair had detractors. And again, this is someone who many people would consider the greatest wrestler of all time. You want to talk about Misawa, Kobashi, people like that? Are you kidding me? Even the All Japan greats from that era had detractors. Thought the head drops were too dangerous. They weren't wrong. You go back a decade. There were people on the PWO forum, which offshoot of DVDVR, who thought Hiroshi Tanahashi was dog shit. Hiroshi Tanahashi. You can go back and see Joe Lanza and Case Lowe defending the honor of Hiroshi Tanahashi and Dragon Gate on the old PWO forums from a decade ago. Now, a lot of people came around on Tanahashi. A lot of his detractors came around on him as well. But in real time, 2012, 2013, a lot of people thought he was the absolute shits. So it's not unusual for wrestlers who are considered all-time greats to have been extremely divisive at one time or another, or even still today. Kurt Angle is still divisive today. He's someone that his harshest detractors in real time have never come around on. And if you want to know some of the reasons why, go read the great Twitter thread at Segundicata on March 5th, the night of March 15th, 11:45 Central. If you're looking forward to the timeline, I got to scroll a little, but he explains it real well. And it was funny because all of this weekend, the old message board posters all came out of the woodwork, and this is what Twitter looked like about 10 years ago. Dylan Hales came out and was throwing out hot takes. So it was a lot of fun watching people who have largely crawled into holes. Twitter is a young person's game now. It's all about engagement and quote tweet dunks and tribalism. And, you know, the thing about Twitter now is nobody talks ball. That's really what it comes down to. Nobody wants to talk ball on Twitter. And a lot of the big Twitter accounts now aren't equipped to talk ball. They aren't. And this weekend really showed that. Because a lot of the old school guys who've been lurking in the weeds came out of those weeds to make some salient points. Check out this Dylan Hales scorcher. And this guy was my arch nemesis for years. Now, me and Dylan get along fine now. It's funny. We spend a lot of time apologizing to each other in the DMs for the vicious arguments we used to get in. Over dumb shit like bull pain matches, right? We've both mellowed out in our older age. Check out his tweet from this weekend, and I quote, "If we are going to talk old school message board controversial takes, how does everyone feel about the widespread view at the time that major portions of Danielson's ROH run were excessive to the point of absurdity? I'm not offering any opinion, genuinely curious on the takes," end quote. That's right. Even Bryan Danielson was subject to divisive opinions during what some think was the greatest run of his career in 2006. No one's immune to this. And that's true. Again, I was there. I lived it. I was at those shows. In fact, Dylan brings up a 1-hour draw that Danielson had with Samoa Joe in Edison, New Jersey. And he says that people in his section, I'll just read you the tweet. Quote, "Knock on Danielson from many at the time was that his matches were needlessly long, among other things. I was at the Joe versus Danielson draw, and there were people in my section saying 15 minutes in, quote, 'They're going to go 60. This sucks,' end quote." Do you know how I know that's true? Because I was at that show, and I was one of the people who knew 15 minutes into that match that they were going 60, who was saying that this sucks. I hated that match. Bryan Danielson, Samoa Joe, 60 minutes, Inman Sports Center, Edison, New Jersey. Inman Sports Club. Excuse me. And I got to tell you, you know, the start of Bryan Danielson's 2006 ROH title reign, I wasn't on board. Now, I came around. I did eventually come around, and I do think, in totality, that was one of, if not the greatest runs of his career. I actually think the current run he's on right now is the greatest run of his career, but that's a discussion for another day. But even Bryan Danielson was subject to this device. And, you know, a lot of times now it's just, you know, people just, I think people have a hard time wrapping their head around the idea, from what I saw this weekend, that there are people who don't think Kurt Angle was an all-time great. It's a little bit jarring and shocking the first time some of your sacred cows are challenged. And I think as wrestling fans, we all feel that shock at some point. Now, most of you listening to this are very deep inside the bubble. You're probably well past that point. But I think that's what a lot of fans this weekend experienced when the old school board posters came out of the woodwork and said, "Now hold on a minute. Dave Meltzer loves Kurt Angle. And by the way, he was wrong then, and he's wrong now." So here's what we're going to do. I got a little project cooked up. And we're going to see if Kurt Angle ever had a 5-star match. I, an accurate star rater, and I think someone who's well equipped to handle this kind of project, because as I said, I'm a Kurt Angle agnostic. I mean, you guys have been listening to me for almost 13 years. Have I ever waxed poetic about Kurt Angle? I don't believe I have. Have I ever buried Kurt Angle the way that a lot of the old school board posters do and did this weekend? No. So I think I'm perfect for this little experiment. I'll give you the details later. But I got a project cooking. And we're going to deep dive Kurt Angle. And I will determine, as an accurate star rater and Kurt Angle agnostic, whether it is true that Kurt Angle never had a 5-star match. Keep an eye out for that. And I tell you, I had my battles on the boards, on Twitter before it became a complete cesspool, with all of the posters. I was often defending a lot of the wrestlers that I just brought up in this segment as being highly divisive. I was on the side of the arguments defending a lot of these guys as a quote-unquote work-rate wrestling fan. And my tastes have evolved and changed over the years. That never stops. Your taste should never stop evolving. You should question yourself if your tastes always stay in one static place. I mean, in general, you're going to like similar, some of the same. I'm not saying you should, over the course of your fandom, drastically change your taste, but, some things that you used to like, you might see flaws in later on. Some things that you didn't appreciate when you were younger, you might appreciate when some years pass. But, man, I had my wars with a lot of these people. I had a lot of my debates, some of them spirited, some of them flat out nasty. The message boards were not always a friendly place to debate. But, in those days, you would learn something. And I'm not trying to do back in the day old guy speech. It's really not that long ago. It's just a few years ago. But, those discussions often, the best ones are where you would learn something or maybe even change your mind on some things. Or at least see the other person's perspective. Now there's just so much blind tribalism and people who aren't open to learning or even really debating. And that's a little disheartening. I'd rather do a wall of text debate with someone who thinks Jerry Lawler is the greatest wrestler of all time and vastly superior to Shingo Takagi if they're coming at it from an angle of good faith and they could support their arguments and at least show their work. Even if ultimately at the end of the debate, I'm going to disagree, then deal with a lot of the nonsense we see today on social media. There are no more message boards. Twitter is an absolute mess. People engagement farming, blindly defending their tribe. There's nothing to be learned. There's nothing interesting to discuss or debate. It's not possible on Twitter anymore, and the boards don't exist. There's Discords where everybody crawls into echo chambers, which I'm not even saying is a knock. We have our own Discord with, there's plenty of knockout dragouts on our Discord. Don't get me wrong. It's not a monolith. There's no groupthink. But in general, it's a group of fans who, in general, in the big picture, in the macro, all have similar tastes in pro wrestling. And I think a lot of group chats and discords and people have retreated back into those sorts of things because they don't want to deal with the utter nonsense. Twitter was there. Believe it or not, there was a time. I don't want to wax poetic about Twitter because it always had its flaws, but there was a time where you could have productive conversations and debates. It was unsustainable, and it was never perfect. It was probably always bad, but it was never as it is today.